Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. My guest today on Psychology to Live By is Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Chloe is a clinical psychologist and USA Today bestseller author of Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. But today, we'll be mostly discussing her new book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. In this book, Chloe explains how to unlock the mental health benefits of free speech. By way of background, Chloe has a BA in psychology from Columbia and graduated summa cum laude with honours, and she has a doctorate in clinical psychology from Long Island University, completing clinical training at Lenox Hill Hospital, Kings County Hospital, and various community and university counselling centres. She's also taught at Long Island University and served as adjunct faculty at the City University of New York. When she's not writing books, Chloe presents on-site and virtual workshops, equipping individuals and organisations to strengthen personal and professional development. She's a consultant at Baker McKenzie, which is the third largest law firm in the world. She's spoken at the 92nd Street Y Summit in 2019 and 2020 and has been a featured speaker for Columbia University's Global Alumni Network on many occasions. And in her spare time, Chloe is an advisory board member for Women's Health magazine, Hearst, and Prevention.com, a featured expert for Psychology Today and a WikiHow brand ambassador. She's appeared as an expert on VH1, Inside Edition, ABC Nightline, and other networks, and has been quoted in outlets like the New York Times, Forbes, Vanity Fair, and Rolling Stone. So, Chloe, you've been very busy, and I'm semi-exhausted just listing all of the above. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. And thanks so much for that very warm introduction. It's really good to be with you.
Fantastic. Let's just start with a broad overview of the book. And what I'm interested in here is, two things, why the book, and then given the book, what are people going to get from it? So I think they're the two broad things. Would you happy with that?
Yeah. So why the book is because I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about free speech right now. It's become a controversial topic. And along with what I think is, in many ways, a good concern about mental health and concerns about hate speech and bullying and safe spaces, those types of things.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of very well-intentioned people that feel like maybe free speech is more trouble than it's worth, and that they need to limit free speech as a way to prioritize mental health and to prioritize a harmonious society. And so I want people to understand that while it might sound nice to think of it that way, as a clinical psychologist, I really believe that the opposite is true, because it's actually through authentic communication and expression that we really truly resolve problems, or we really truly create safe spaces, meaning where disagreement can actually be tolerated. So that's why the book. And also, sorry, one more reason of why the book is I think a lot of people, frankly, including me up to a certain point in time, had also felt like, well, maybe it's better to just hold back, because if I speak up, I could really, get in hot water. And so the safe thing to do is to just, stay quiet if I have a controversial take on something. And I wanted people to know that a lot of repression and suppression is actually not good for our mental health. And so there is a cost to staying quiet. So then what will people get from the book? Your second question is part one. I explore the mental health benefits of free speech from a cognitive, emotional, and social perspective. And then part two is how to do it, how to speak up, and how to encourage other people to speak freely around you.
Fantastic. So it's obviously, I think anyway, a very timely book, and for all the reasons that should be obvious to people, especially polarization. I think the last 20 or 30 years, the rise of what in my day was called political correctness, but these days sort of more known as wokeness, and the impacts that's had on universities, on workplaces, and on culture in general, and the difficulties I think that we're all facing, broaching difference with people, I guess is one way of saying it. But let's just start with, you spend quite a bit of time early in the book on the benefits, or the gifts, I think you call it, of language. Would you like just to give us a little summary of that, and maybe why you spent quite a bit of time there?
Yeah, definitely. The reason I spent quite a bit of time on it is because I found that language it's almost like breathing. It's something that we do so often and so naturally that we take it for granted, that we don't realize how essential and important it is. We just don't think about it. And even I, as a clinical psychologist, which, we're kind of known for talking about the value of words and expressing yourself and the harms of repression. We're known for this, right? And
Yeah.
to be honest, it didn't even occur to me to really think about the mental health benefits of free speech until I had, some experiences that led me to start speaking up about things I had previously done what we call self-censorship about. And then it was by speaking up and taking those risks that I began to notice the effects on my own cognition and emotion and social relationships. And then it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, how could I, as a clinical psychologist, have not realized that, of course, speaking up and being authentic is good for your mental health. So that was why I spent so much time wanting to really explain to people the science. And so now to explain it, the gift of the cognitive gifts of language. So when we put our inner life into words, what we're doing, and again, it's like breathing, it's so natural we don't think about it. But what we are doing is we're taking an abstract, amorphous, internal experience, just an inner swirl, and we're putting it into an organized, rational system called language that other people, of course, can understand and that facilitates logic. If it weren't for language, we wouldn't be able to make conditional statements or if-then statements, right? So by putting things into words, we actually also increase not only our ability to be rational, but we increase our problem-solving abilities. And I share this in the book as well, that there's a lot of research references about this, that when people have had to solve complex problems without verbalizing what they're doing versus with verbalizing what they're doing, they actually do a lot better. And as a really simple, relatable example, haven't we all had the experience even of just saying something aloud, and then as we say it aloud, we're like, oh gosh, that doesn't make sense as I hear myself say it, right? So speaking gives us an incredible cognitive benefit to become analytical about our thoughts in a way that we just couldn't otherwise. So that's the gift of the cognitive gift of language. And then I can go on with the emotional gifts of
Yes.
language, but I can pause too.
Yeah, of course. Because obviously, there are several filters through which I'm listening to you, and one is as a therapist, and a therapist of some decades, I must add, and it's been my observation that in many senses, it's not like I as a therapist or you as a therapist don't have some useful function, but by and large, people help themselves, and they do this via, it was called a talking cure for a reason. I think that when people articulate, we can be a holding space for what they're saying, and then they can articulate something new. You're holding that complexity for them, and so I think that that's a very important function. And obviously, the opposite of that is that we can get caught in the limitations of our own thinking if we don't fully articulate, right? And our capacity to hold things in the mind is far more limited than our capacity to articulate complex things. Anyway, so
No, thank you. That is so, so important. I'm writing down what you're saying, honestly, because it's so stimulating. But you're right. So our, as you just said, our capacity to hold things in our head, is limited, but then being able to speak about them, it expands it. And then I think that's in part due to the fact that our working memory can only hold seven plus or minus. I know you know this. I'm just sharing for
no, this,
your
this is for the
audience.
audience. No, I'm nodding
Yeah.
enthusiastically here.
Yeah. That our working memory can only hold seven plus or minus two items. And that's like if we're really just focusing on simply holding something in our working memory. But if we're holding a complex idea or something that has more, kind of subcategories attached to it, it's even more difficult. So if you think about then you're trying to solve a complex problem or grapple with, a complex thought, and you're just doing it all in your head, you're so much more limited. But if you've listed it out and talked it out with somebody, you can build and expand on it, almost like you're starting to kind of write a verbal paper with a friend. And
Yeah.
yeah, as you put it, the talking cure, there is something really cathartic as well. We're kind of getting into the emotional gifts of language there. But yeah, when we speak, and as you said, when somebody else is really listening and holding that, that's getting into the social benefits. But studies have shown, and I share these in the book too, that when, say, you're talking, or actually I'm talking, so I'll say me, if I'm talking and you're really listening, what's so interesting is that my brain can actually tell if you're really listening or not, or if you're pretending to. There have been studies done where like the
Yep.
listener just pretends to listen. And when you really listen, my brain responds differently and my cortisol levels will start to go down, and the problem solving capacity of our talk will increase. It's so amazing.
Yeah, look, as I said, I think before we came on air, there's so many things that we could, I think, riff on. But one of them is that because what I think sits behind a lot of this is fearfulness. And when someone listens to us in the way that you just described, it's very calming. And, there's the release of oxytocin and other important, chemicals and neurotransmitters that allows us to just sort of calm down. And not only calm down, but become more intelligent and more creative. So, as you said, we've already, I think, quite naturally moved into the emotional benefits. So let's go back to the book, and we'll no doubt. I think we've set up a pattern here. We'll do that, and then we'll just talk about whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, and one more benefit too on the cognitive
Yeah.
side, and I think this is so interesting too, and as you, of course, with your mindfulness background too, is that when we speak what's in our mind, it actually also helps to create a detachment from it. So that, I can say something and, like I said, say it. And as I, realize, oh, gee, maybe that doesn't make sense. And I can kind of dismiss it or let it go. But what it's also doing is it's helping me understand that my thoughts are separate from me, which again is, I think, so important for people that say, well, we got to get rid of, we have to limit speech because of hate speech and bullying. And, if we just tell really racist, awful people that they can't speak, somehow that will help. Whereas I explain in the book that actually true, like, flag flying racists, like members of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that, the ones who leave that cult or whatever you want to call it, they do it because somebody has a conversation with them. There's
Yes.
there's a man named Daryl Davis who has written a book as well. I'm sure you know, and
Yeah.
it's the actually the experience of talking about things that we can cognitively come to separate from those things and realize that those things are not us. It's a really amazing process that language gives us, again, that we just don't even realize. We take it for granted because it's like breathing.
It's an extraordinary thing, and a couple of thoughts. One is that the uh, the example you give there is a really good illustration of what happens when someone feels respected, not necessarily agreed with, but fundamentally accepted as another valuable human being with dignity. That something relaxes and it opens up a possibility for changing one's mind, and which is not there prior to that, right? Because one's identity is so tightly bound to very often not very rigorously tested beliefs. So there's a fantastic book called How Minds Change by David McRaney, where he looks at the various methods, and some of these, of course, you and I be very familiar with, like motivational interviewing, which is this way of really helping people understand what's motivating their reluctance to change and understanding that for more independently. The other thing is something I think he calls it street canvassing. And again, it's this sort of unconditional positive regard and an absolute willingness to understand, not necessarily agree with again, but to really genuinely want to understand why a person holds a view. And as you said, often when they articulate why they hold a view, there's that sort of a fantastic moment where they go, "Oh, hang on a second, that doesn't really make total sense," and that
Yeah, it's
wasn't
so
available.
true.
Yeah, go, you go.
Yeah, it's so true. And, it's there's something as well as I'm sure called group polarization,
Yeah.
where, if you try to shout someone down or tell them that they're so wrong that they shouldn't speak, all it does is actually harden them and polarizes them, more into saying, well, that person just doesn't understand and I don't like them, therefore I must be even more like, farther away from them than I thought. And I wanted to just respond to something else that you said too a couple times, which I think is important. You said, listening to the person respectfully, not necessarily agreeing with them. You emphasized several times, and I would personally get caught up in that myself a little bit in the past. Writing this book was very helpful for me to like really reflect about my own patterns. And so one of the techniques in part two of the book, under thought replacement, there's thought replacements for speaking up and for listening. And so one of the listening thought replacements, if you're listening to someone that's saying things that you think are kind of nuts, but you want to maintain a good listening stance, in part maybe to help them to reflect and change, or to also make it so that they'll listen to you nicely when it's your turn to talk. But one of the thought replacements I have for that is listening doesn't mean agreeing, to just
Mm.
silently repeat that to myself, because I used to really be afraid that if I just listened without saying anything, that it was like a tacit agreement. And so then I would feel like I had to jump in and kind of assert or contradict. And it was truly spoiling certain conversations. So that was the thought
Yeah.
replacement that helped me.
I mean, just that one thing would make an enormous difference to an enormous number of people. Like, as you say, there's a huge amount of self censoring going on all sides of the political debates, where people run a kind of cost benefit analysis about, should I speak up, or should I, or indeed should I listen? Am I sanctioning these evil thoughts if I listen without attacking? And
Is my silence violence?
yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
yeah, perhaps you should articulate this idea that silence is violence and words are violence. I think we skipped over that a little, but I think that's a very important part of what you're saying.
Thanks. Yeah, that's right in the introductory part. Is the introductory section is called "No Words Are Not Violence," right? Because it's one of those phrases So catchy. I have to give it credit for that. It sounds almost poetic, right? Words are violence, when people say that. But the problem is that when people take that literally, they're taking something like, oh, his words were like a slap in the face, or, her words were like a punch in the gut to me. And they're taking something that, really should be a metaphor, and then they're converting it into something literal. And as a psychologist, what that activates for me is thoughts about actually psychoticism. Psychoticism meaning someone who's having a break with reality. And again, not just, people who speak with metaphors, but there's a growing number of people that are taking that phrase quite literally, especially, frankly, within the trans movement. I've seen a lot of the phrasing like, well, you're threatening my existence if you, say that I'm not really a man or woman or whatever it is. And then they feel compelled or validated to respond with actual violence because humans have a very productive, hardwired need for reciprocity. So, it helps us with our survival mechanisms that if somebody helps you, you feel like you need to help them back. And so interesting studies where that's why the sales tables have a little candy on them, because if you take the candy, you feel like now you have to listen to their spiel. And then it works the other way too with codes of justice, going all the way back to Hammurabi, right? That if someone has been violent to you, you're justified on some level to be violent back, at least in terms of self-defense and possibly further, depending on the culture. But so when people then have that in their minds, we see things like the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Or I give multiple examples in the book of speakers, people who are simply expressing views and ideas that are met with actual physical violence by attackers that in their minds believe that they are defending themselves, even though they are the person who is going in there and becoming violent. And just one more quick thing to say about that, which is just that when we silence people from talking, we're actually ironically encouraging violence, right? Because as you and I know, if we're working with violent offenders, the first thing we want to do is get them to learn how to use dialogue, not their fists when they're upset, right?
So much again that we could sort of jump off and but there's a couple of little maybe key words here that fit with what you're saying. One is this idea of safetyism, like you have trigger warnings and so on, and even more broadly, I think maybe an overprotective attitude in parenting, helicopter parenting, but this sense in which people are fragile in some way, the sense in which words will, we used to say as kids, sticks and stones don't break your bones, and so I think we should talk about victimhood, safetyism, this idea that people are fragile, and obviously I think it's spawned quite a literature now, which is really good in reaction. You've got Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, for example, which is suggesting that we're creating fragility. The coddling of the American mind, would be a good example. Or I think Scott Barry Kaufman's recently written a book called Rise Above, which is about victimhood. And there's the other one is that book by Manning, and other name escapes me, but it's on the rise of victimhood culture. So I think there's a general terrain here that we should talk about for a while, because my sense in reading your book was that this is really what the book is about. It's about letting people regain their sense of autonomy, control, and dignity. So I'll stop talking. You're the guest, but there's a few golf balls that I've put on tees for you.
Yeah, thank you. No, and I love hearing you talk about this. So please jump in anytime. I honestly, I find your thoughts about this really enriching. But yeah, there's certainly an element of the book that is about this kind of weaponization of victimhood. Um, Not even always a weaponization, sometimes a genuine, misunderstanding, of oneself as being truly victimized by words, but also sometimes on purpose. Because I explained something in the book, which again, I'm sure you're aware of, called the secondary gains of
Yeah.
victimhood. Which for your listening audience, in case they're not familiar with that, it's a commonplace psychology term. It's not, fringe or controversial. It's in any psychology 101 textbook, you'll learn about secondary gains. And the classic example is a little girl who breaks her leg and enjoys that she, due to her broken leg, gets to miss gym class and everybody signs her cast and it's so much fun that when the cast is ready to come off, she insists that her leg is still broken and she must still be sick because she insists it's broken. She's not even lying in the textbook example. People can get so genuinely attached to the gains of their victimhood in an unconscious, completely innocent manner that they can cling to that victimhood status, which again, but people can also do it consciously and weaponize it. So what that might look like in, day-to-day life, I share some examples in the book about a woman who insists that she's the victim of workplace bullying, right? And one of her perks from that is that her poor performance at work is being temporarily overlooked while the bullying allegation is being investigated because there's a possibility that her poor performance is due, to the bullying. And then as we really start to unpack it, and this is, I share kind of some anonymized client stories and things like that. We come to realize that in fact she's frequently needling the so-called bully herself, right? And that there's this big perk to her being labeled as the bully. And that can also come across in social narratives, again, where it's like, well, you as a man, you can't talk about such and such. You can't talk about abortion as a man because that would be victimizing me as a woman. That would make you, a bad man for trying to tell women what to do or, something like that. So I just think it's important to bring to light that a lot of times people will feel genuinely victimized by people expressing their words and ideas, or they will wield it manipulatively. But either way, the result is the same, that they're using the victimhood as a way to try to shut people up from other people feel like you can't express yourself because your words are, quote, victimizing me. And then there's this little status that I then get, which is that I get to control what you say because I claim this victim label. So I just want people to understand what that process is in the first place, because I think a lot of people, if I hadn't read the psychology textbook, I genuinely wouldn't know or understand it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, first off, obviously, we're distinguishing people who are actually being victimized.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about that there's no such thing as trauma or victimization. We're talking about victimhood, which is
Mm-hmm.
this psychological process that you've described. And, and I read this book. I remembered I had the notes on this, the one about the rise of victimhood culture, and there were four
Mm-hmm.
features of it, and I've got them here to remind me. A constant feeling that person needs a recognition of their victimhood, right? So this
Mm-hmm.
is it. The first feature. The second is a kind of moral superiority or a moral elitism that the victimhood bestows upon you. The third is a lack of empathy for pain to others, right? So it's not all squeaky clean, and the fourth is a constant rumination on past victimization. So in other words, this becomes an entire identity, but a highly, highly self-destructive one. And of course, as you indicate, it has a destructive element in relation to people who are being positioned as bullies or victimizers.
Yes. Yes, as
Yeah.
well as to the supposed victim, because
Yeah.
no matter how it starts off, whether it's an intentional thing that you're wielding and then you come to believe it, or you just internalize it right from the start, if you see yourself as a victim of other people's words, I explain in the book about the connection like to true actual clinical pathology mental health, like anxiety and depression. One of the hallmark symptoms of depression is a sense of helplessness, right? And so,
Yeah.
how helpless could you be if somebody says the wrong thing to you? Then, heck, it's like you got run over with a car. Or, I mean,
Yeah.
also with anxiety to think, heaven forbid I hear the wrong thing, or heaven forbid I say the wrong thing. What an anxiety provoking, depressive way to live your life. And then, interestingly, the statistics bear it out that the demographics of people that are most likely, to get on the words or violence bandwagon are also statistically the most likely to report that they're suffering from anxiety or depression. And
Yeah.
my hope is to free them. I'm not trying to even criticize them. I'm trying to
Yeah.
help them understand that the boogeyman isn't real. People's words, you don't have to be afraid of that, nor should you try to therefore stop them from speaking.
Yeah, a couple of things here. A lot of my work has been in organisations, particularly in mental health in the workplace, and I investigated, I think, 150 cases of. Most of them were said to be bullying, but they were where people had a psychological diagnosis that they said was caused by the workplace. So, my role was to interview basically everyone concerned and do some psychometrics on the person concerned. And, most cases, our legislation's pretty clear about what constitutes bullying, and most cases didn't constitute bullying. It usually constituted managers, in particular, behaving very unskillfully, being perhaps rude, not very not very nice, but certainly not bullying. And but what I observed, which reflects what you're saying, was tragic, in that people's identity started to move from being an industrious, productive person, in the workplace and in society in general, towards being this sort of victim identity, and they would shrink in their capacity in life. And it wasn't a comfort zone. They weren't. I mean, obviously, they were looking for a secondary gain in terms of workers' compensation payouts,
Hmm.
and secondary gains in terms of them being right and the other person being wrong, and
Hmm.
the village all acknowledging that.
Hmm.
But what ended up happening is, even if they were successful in the claim, they were highly damaged by the process. They became less and less capable of returning to work. They they became more fragile. So they were now in a situation where they were in a sense of safety, not comfort, but a sense of safety from this dangerous world, but never really got back to work. And I think in many cases, if not most, that was avoidable. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've been so encouraged. I've been surprised that I have actually been invited to speak at places, like a big law firm or
Yeah.
like Columbia University, places that I did not think were going to be at all hospitable to this message. But to my surprise and delight, they've been open to hearing about it. So my hope is that maybe the tide is turning a little bit.
I think it is. I mean, I was reflecting on this conversation, before we had it. I had an option very early in my career to be an academic, and I decided not to. And the main reason was I felt uncomfortable with this rising tide of political correctness.
Me
Um,
too.
and Yeah, also, I think I really wanted to get out into the world in a sense,
Yeah.
and do clinical work, and as it turned out, lots of organisational work. But part of me regrets not, doing research, and I love the world of ideas and books and what we're doing today. But I think it's been a long time coming, and I think it is. it is ebbing somewhat because, as you've discovered inside the law firms and universities, there are a lot of people who've, quite frankly, that gives them the shits. They hate it.
Yeah,
Um, and they feel like they've been gagged for a long time, you know. And
totally.
and so let's just talk a little bit here. So I guess what we're encompassing a type of self-harm and fragility, victimhood, bullying. But let's just turn it to the hopefully a more uplifting and positive
Yeah.
dimension. The thing I'd like to talk about in particular is human creativity. So the idea being that out of whether it's just internal conflict or it's conflict in argument and discussion with someone else, that this is where all the real breakthroughs come, right? This is where we really grow and learn. It's not by just repeating to ourselves what we know to be true, but actually there's a kind of epistemic or knowledge-based humility in recognizing the limits of one's own understanding and being able to tolerate someone who's got a different view. And so again,
Diversity,
yeah,
diversity of opinion and thought. Yeah.
totally. I mean, that could be the single thing we put in the DEI sort of kit bag that I think would make the most difference. Anyway, I'm again putting golf balls on tees for you to
Yeah.
tee off on.
Thank you. Yeah, and honestly, they're such amazing thoughts. You truly stimulating. Um, but yeah, so as far as the creativity goes, what when you talk about that, what's interesting there, and I share this in the book too, and I'm sure you know that the unconscious is pre-verbal, right? And so, when we think of, amazing artists and, just true creative expression, a lot of times what they're doing is, they have this gift for like kind of pouring forth, from the unconscious and bringing it into something that we can see and understand with our conscious mind. And I think that's again something that's so wonderful about language is that when we feel we can speak freely, when we can just, kind of let things out and be playful with language and not worry, is that joke going to get me in trouble or is it okay to say this or
Yeah.
when we start to take some of the locks off of ourselves and really invite that creative unconscious side to come forward, yeah, I think we do get more creative. And also I think when we think of creativity, a lot of times too we think of emotion, and when we label our emotions with language, what that does is it actually starts to settle down our amygdala, which, I'm sure you're aware, but just in case your listeners may not know, the amygdala is what's sometimes called the house of fear. It's a little simplistic these days. They've discovered that the limbic system of the brain is more complex, but just in general, the amygdala would get really active, if you see a rattlesnake or something. And it's not the time and place to have a conversation, right? And that's fine. The amygdala is telling you, hey, not time for dialogue, time to just get out of here, right? But for many people, the amygdala will get really active if somebody says that they voted for someone that you don't like, or, that they see a, immigration policy differently than you do. And so when we can then start, nevertheless, remaining verbal, remaining in dialogue, and naming the emotions that we're experiencing in a respectful way and saying, wow, I have to admit, I get a little nervous when I think about those open borders. Or somebody else might say, I get a little nervous when I think about turning people away, or, whatever it is. But to be able to name the emotions, and then we can settle down the amygdala, and then we can become, more creative. We can be brave enough to be able to stand there and grapple with new ideas and confront new ways of thinking about things. And moreover, also in terms of the creativity, when we have a really good heart to heart, our cortisol levels actually drop. And of course, the cortisol is the stress hormone. And so when you think about yourself in your super stress state, that's generally not when you're free and creative and vibrant, right? It's more when you're having those amazing talks with people and, feeling understood. That's when our, true creative self can emerge.
Yeah, I think we, in a prior conversation, my doctorate was on this very process of, we get new insights only when you switch off these fight flight systems, you switch off, and it allows a much more widespread, relaxed style of cognition where we can connect things that aren't normally connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can literally have thoughts that weren't possible for us before, right? And that an essential part of that is this sense of self-forgetting and just general okayness, So
Yeah, we're not walking on eggshells or
no,
feeling like we're in a verbal landmine situation.
exactly. And so this leads me perhaps to one final topic area. And again, I was thinking about this, about how in the evolution of our species, as you I think lay out very nicely in the book, the development of language was crucial. Um, it's the foundation upon which we build culture and civilization and technology, and indeed we pass it on. Nonetheless, we have countervailing instincts of violence and tribalism and defensiveness and selfishness and greed and deception, all the sins. So part of my view of the world, I guess, is that civilization is a constant achievement. That it requires us being civil to each other, like being polite. I mean, I'm quite old-fashioned in that way. I really believe in politeness, and because there's a recognition, I think. I mean, everyone's just leaving aside Ku Klux Klan and sociopaths. People are just trying to cope. Their means often, in my view, suck. Like even when people are violent, there is a sense that there's a desire for control very often, or a fear of not being in control. And who wouldn't want to be in control? Who wouldn't want to get rid of that fear? So, what I think for me, one of the great contributions of this book is in the re-civilizing process. This process of allowing people to talk again and discover that these aren't demons on the other side of the political divides. That we can actually have the capability of having conversations where prior our too hasty cost-benefit analysis said not worth doing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so I agree with you so much about civilization, and I do talk about that in the book, about the incredible evolutionary role of language, that it allows us to rapidly form trust bonds and make future oriented plans together, and connect about shared history, like all these amazing things. And civilization and civics and being civil to each other as we do that is so important. And then adjacent and within that, I think, is this issue of politics, because that's always the big hot button issue for people. And I say that as if it's one issue, right? Like people are like, oh, well, yeah, but it's just politics. But how can we have a civil society where nobody can talk about politics, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of people think that they're not talking about politics, but yet or that it's somehow even possible. But if we unpack the etymology of the word politics, it just means shared public space, right? So if people, and it's interesting too, my previous book focused on what's called high functioning people, and high functioning people, which I'm sure all of your listeners are, they take an interest in the world around them. They take an interest in the society and the culture in which they live. There's nothing wrong with said, that it's actually, again, a mark of flourishing to not only be able to, meet your own basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter, but to go beyond that and have an interest in the society in which you live. So if people have any thoughts, about what should be happening in the education system around them, or, again, say immigration or healthcare, or how to deal with violent crime in your society, basically everything that has to do with public life in some way is going to be under the category of politics. And so to your point, I totally agree. We have to learn how to, navigate and discuss our values and our public life together without thinking that that's, rude, because I think if we don't do it at all, we forget how to do it politely. And then, we can demonize and vilify each other when we don't, when we get in these little silos. So yeah, I totally agree. I think it's important. People used to say, well, you can't talk about religion, sex, or politics. Probably sex is probably still something we shouldn't bring up at dinner parties, right?
Yeah.
But, religion and politics, or, what's happening in your town and your country and the world and how you feel about it. I mean, how could we say that that's somehow not good to talk about?
I know. Again, I was thinking about just growing up and the difference at the dinner table back then to now. And there were lots of conversations about religion and politics and lots of disagreement.
Sure.
And sometimes it was uncomfortable, but it was just considered, well, that's part of what happens over when you break bread is you argue.
Absolutely. And have your mind changed. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
that too as a little girl, and talking about politics, with my family at the table. And even, it sounds ridiculous, but even on the playground, like we would talk about some of that stuff,
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm mindful that the time has flown, and
Yeah.
we could talk for a very long time. But just to finish, I'd like to obviously thank you for coming onto the podcast, and we may next year in the new year we may conjure up another conversation. We'll see. I want to thank you for the book. I think, as I said, I think it's very timely, very important. I encourage people to buy it and read it. And if people want to know more about you or to contact you, how should they do that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation too. So the easiest way is to go to freespeechtoday.com. It goes to my website, which is drchloe.com, which I think is just hard for people to spell. So I put freespeechtoday.com. So that's super easy. And, you can go there and learn about my books and follow me on social media. And I'm also kind of playing with the idea of some just free discussion groups for people that want to just practice talking about some of these things. I've had a couple already, and they've been interesting. And if somebody's listening and you are at a university or whatever, and I charge for corporations, but if it's like a university book club or, whatever, I love to just pop on and share some techniques and talk about this stuff. It's really a passion project for me. So I just want to invite people to feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. And so once again, thank you so much. It was a delightful conversation, and I look forward to our paths crossing again. Take care.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Chris. Have a beautiful day in Australia. Take care.
I'll do my best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you like the podcast and want to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. There you'll find links to my various social media posts, a newsletter, and lots more. And share the podcast with people you like, so they can like it too. And a little more cello and guitar from the wonderful duo Desire and Date.